Hey everyone, greetings again. I am back from my travels and I'm recording this on the Monday of our new week. We're in week 3 of our summer session here in the Survey of Rhetorical Tradition. And week 3 is looking at rhetoric as public confrontation. I think I mentioned in one of the previous videos that this class is not a history class necessarily, but the way that the weekly themes are set up does kind of move historically. So we started out looking at Aristotle, went way back to the beginning, and then the second week largely about Kenneth Burke and the kind of middle part of the 20th century. In the 50s and 40s through the 60s is when he was writing his key books on rhetoric and motives. And now this next set of readings for this week on public confrontation takes us into the sort of the 70s and 80s, a little bit into the 90s, and then the next week on cultural power will take us through the 90s into the kind of the aughts and so on, and a little bit up to our current moment. But then I want to finish off by looking at kind of the digital techie stuff, and that kind of covers in very quick fashion the kind of the major beats in the rhetorical tradition. So hopefully things are going okay out there in terms of working with the materials and through the materials. And as I mentioned in an announcement, focusing on these videos will, I think, help you with the reading in terms of what to read and what to focus on. Because basically the stuff I'm talking about in these discussion videos, lecture videos, is what I consider to be the most relevant key stuff. So if you're focusing on these and looking at the readings with kind of both of these things happening simultaneously, then you'll get the most important bits. So for this video, I'm going to go through the 2 shorter readings for this week. The first one by Zarefsky, The Decline of Public Debate, and then the second one by Goodnight, which is also a short little piece on, just called Public Discourse, I think. And these are 2 major rhetoric / kind of political comm scholars, both retired, I think, at this point. But they're quite well known for their work in the realm of rhetoric, political comm, public sphere kind of stuff, argumentation, and so on. And so this week we want to be looking at rhetoric as this kind of public phenomenon. So I mentioned in an announcement and a message to you all that we want to be trying to focus on rhetoric. The examples that we're using are meant to come from the public. That's this kind of weird space. We know the word, we understand, I think, what it means, but for our purposes, for communication and rhetoric purposes, we want to kind of drill down a little bit more on what we're talking about there. I taught a class on the public sphere, on these very issues for a number of years. Very successful class, probably the best class I've ever taught in terms of feedback and reception from students and what I feel we accomplished in that class. But I haven't actually taught the public sphere class in about 6 or 7 years. It just doesn't really feel relevant in the same way. So oddly and maybe sadly, it feels like a kind of diminishing phenomenon, but I think it's still worth reading this stuff and thinking about these issues. And I'd be very eager and curious to know what you all think about the way they're talking about rhetoric as public in this way. So let me just launch in. I think, get through both of these pretty quickly. Starting with the Zarefsky piece. This is coming from a popular press. This is USA Today, and this is coming from 1998. It's meant to be a kind of a brief overview of some important issues that he's sending out into a popular, which is broader than public. It's very, very wide kind of an audience. Even so, there's some stuff in here that's a little bit more specific and technical than we want to go. So I'm not just going to skip over the history stuff. And I'm mostly interested in just how he talks about public. And you'll notice in here that in the first paragraph, he talks about private and technical and public. So he's kind of invoking the work of Goodnight, which we'll get into next, who came up with this public, private, technical kind of distinction, all right? So we won't dwell too much about that because we'll get back into it in a moment. But, we can think about private sphere stuff as relationships, daily conversations. And this is why in that message I suggested that we try to stay away from that. We teach interpersonal communication classes in our department, and that's really, the focus of those classes. In rhetoric, it's more outward, like, focus. It's more about our kind of collective, the space of our kind of collective engagement, right? And so we're talking about, like, strangers. We're talking about people who we live nearby and interact with, who we might not necessarily know personally or professionally. So the public sphere differs from both of these, he says in the second paragraph. That the important point here is that what counts as public or a public matter is anything that affects us in our generic capacity as citizens, right? So he says, generically as persons or as citizens, without regard to personal identity and regardless of whether they participate in the conversation, right? So if something affects us, right, it affects us as members of some kind of collective. You don't have to think about citizenship, because citizenship sort of implies the kind of formal requirements, like I'm Canadian, right? I'm not an American citizen, and yet I live here. Things affect me, the cost of power these days, the cost of groceries. Like, these are things that affect us all, so they count as a public matter. To the extent that anything affects us as a kind of shared interest or concern, or essentially a problem, then we are engaged in it, whether actively or kind of passively. It still kind of touches us, and it's relevant as a public concern, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about here as a public matter. Public matters are those of common concern. That's a great line. I hope you can kind of get that in there. Public matters are those of common concern, things that we ought to and probably are concerned about, that affect us, right? And they don't tend to affect us in happy ways. They tend to affect us in ways that we are concerned by, frustrated with, maybe even angry about, right? That's when we mobilize, and that's when we engage in this kind of rhetorical activity. So he goes and he does a history here. And I'm less interested in us getting the details of the history. You can read through it. It's quite interesting. It's drawing on the work of Jürgen Habermas, a German social communication, mostly a social theorist, but also interested in communication. And he wrote the kind of the key book on the public sphere, what he calls the bourgeois public sphere. It comes out of the 18th century of, like, salon culture and print culture. And it's really documenting a kind of shift in power, right? A shift away from the elite, like, the monarchy, that kind of elite, and more toward the people. Now, we're still talking about, like, sort of the professionals, the educated classes. All right, so it's not necessarily everyone, but the point of his analysis is that this is sort of the first time where the people gather together, talk about issues that affect them, and then kind of mobilize for change, right? And that's a unique and important point of history, because it really informs the 19th and 20th century. If you think about any important social rights kind of movement, whether it be going back in the 19th century and the women's rights movement that started in the 1830s and Seneca, and all of the kind of agitation around workers' rights and on and on and on through the centuries, this is largely how it takes shape. People come together, they discuss, they deliberate, they engage, and then they mobilize. So this is an important arena for thinking about rhetoric. So just go ahead and skip through the second page. He's giving us critiques of media and so on and so on. We're less interested in that. Those kind of discussions aren't quite as relevant today because they've been kind of obliterated by social media and the digital stuff. So both of these pieces were written before the digital revolution and the internet. And so we need to kind of, like, keep that in mind, right? But there's still the kind of the core concepts, I think, are still useful. But if you look in the second page, second column, right around that kind of the section break, he says, instead of trying to collapse, there's this kind of debate about, like, well, historically the public sphere, the bourgeois public sphere, did not include everyone. Not everyone's interests were included. It was mostly the kind of the educated professional class, right? And they weren't necessarily speaking on behalf of everyone, especially those who were not only not considered citizens, but were considered, like, other than human even. We're talking about slaves, we're talking about Native American Indians and so on, right? What about them? Okay, so his point is like, that's even more reason for those who find themselves on the margin to try to get into the conversation. And it's also why we should do better at expanding the arena of the public, right? So there was a lot of debate in public sphere theory about, like, do we want one big public or a whole bunch of kind of smaller publics, and how do we think about the relationship between sort of the dominant public and the sort of smaller publics, and on and on. But his argument is, like, we should try to always enlarge the space of conversation and participate in it to sort of together, right? And that ought to be the goal, because then we have more kind of equality, coherence, cohesiveness. The other main thing that we want to just look at in this reading here is this business of deliberation, and we'll note it, and then we'll probably kind of just sort of like move onward from that. But at the time that Zarefsky was writing this, and also at the time that Goodnight was writing his stuff, although it's a little less emphasized in his piece, but this business of deliberation for Zarefsky is sort of the whole part of it, right? So we want citizens, or we want, if not citizens, think about like community members, right? However you think about community. Community can be big, it can be smaller. But if you find yourself as a member of a citizen or a collective, he wants this kind of engagement. He wants awareness, education, right? Keeping yourself informed with what's going on. And then when you get frustrated or you get agitated about what's going on, then you kind of lean in and you go and sort of join this public conversation. But as an argumentation kind of scholar and a debate kind of practitioner, Zarefsky and others really want to insist on the importance of deliberation. So there's a certain quality of conduct, a certain kind of like procedurality that ought to attend with the kind of ways that we engage each other. And so he calls this deliberation, and he says right in that first paragraph in that section there, reclaiming the public sphere requires asking not only who may be in it, but what goes on there. The answer clearly is that the public sphere is the place for deliberation. We should deliberate with each other. You know, we should have arguments, debates, discussions. And when we're doing that, we should try to adhere to certain kinds of sort of operating principles. For instance, the process of talking and thinking together, it's characterized by this next few lines, circle, underline, star, these are important. Characterized by broad participation, so we should all be able to kind of lean in and have our say. Civility. Civility's come under a lot of critique since he wrote this, but this was sort of the idea of like, try to engage one another as you would wish to be gauged by the other, right? To try to maintain the norm of decency, of like turn taking. So civility, a diversity of views, let's get lots of broad perspectives and orientations, a willingness to consider opposing arguments. That one is important, gets at this idea of reciprocity. You want to have your say, but in order to have your say, it ought to be the case that someone else gets to have their say, right? This is sort of like interpersonal kind of stuff, right? When you go to therapy with your couples therapy or whatever, like you get to have your say, but then so do they. Like both perspectives matter. So that's part of this deliberation thing. Willingness to consider opposing arguments and re-examine one's own, comparison of different approaches and their trade-offs, and a focus on broad themes and values rather than technical details. All of that stuff is pretty important when we're thinking about public engagement and how it ought to, be conducted. Now, he goes on to sort of talk about the fact that we don't really have this, and it's sad, and we want it more, and so he wrote that back at the turn of the century, turn of the millennium, 1998, right? Century and millennium. And so we're 24 years on, and I think he would probably not think that we've reclaimed deliberation. Maybe in smaller pockets, but not in terms of like the broad social participation. So from the Zarefsky reading, this really interesting and I think useful way of conceptualizing publicness, right? Matters of common concern. And then thinking about the kind of the ways that we engage one another when we engage each other as members of a collective. That's really what I want us to pull out of that Zarefsky piece. And with that, and I'll just quickly move into Goodnight. And he goes through and he talks about the distinctions between private, technical, and public. I don't know that these are too tricky. So personal spheres, conversation, language is open-ended, it's ongoing. There's no necessary sense of urgency. It's exploratory, it's zigzaggy, it's wide open, right? That's personal conversation, personal sphere. The technical sphere is just that. Think about professions, think about occupations, think about any kind of like highly specific area of human endeavor where you're off creating something, exploring something, and there's often a certain kind of language or vocabulary, set of understandings and norms that operate in that field. I would say that this experience with the COVID, the pandemic and the virus and the vaccine and all that kind of stuff, we had the spheres of the public and the technical, and frankly the personal too, because we were all stuck in our homes, right? All of these spheres kind of smashed together. And I think part of the problem, masks, debate over getting the vaccine and so on, is I think because these realms got so confused and so overlapped, right? So that you have these technical experts trying to communicate in public, but then you have these kind of private citizens seeing this communication, questioning it, not understanding it, and then you have private citizens sort of injecting themselves in the public as experts, even though they're not, and it just got so muddied. And I don't know, maybe you could argue that the whole kind of mess of it was because of these overlapping and sort of fluid spheres of overlap between these two realms, or these three realms. Anyway, the public sphere, and he's basically saying what Zarefsky says, or Zarefsky's basically saying what Goodnight's saying. This is on the second page here in the left column. He says, the language of public address emanates from a community tradition of deciding and discussing priorities, right? How should we proceed? What should we do? Constraining and projecting habituated prejudgments and indulging and confronting common problems. While public discourse makes open and common collective preference, it also provides an arena where interests conduct controversy and openly struggle for power, right? So again, we're engaging in the realm of conversation about matters of common concern, but because we live in a world of scarcity, of limited resources, including time and attention and knowledge, there's a lot of stakes in terms of the outcomes of these conversations. And so it ends up being largely about power. We're going to get more into these issues next week, but public engagement, Zarefsky doesn't really talk about this, and he probably ought to have, right? But we're also engaged in sort of struggles over power. Oh, who gets the voice? Who gets to decide? What are the values that matter to us all? What are the outcomes that we can tolerate and ones that we can't tolerate, right? Who gets to decide anyway? These are the questions about publicness that matter. And oftentimes the questions are about the very conduct of how it is we're engaging ourselves in and as a public, right? So there's lots of discussion lately about inclusivity, inclusion, exclusion, inclusion, right? Who gets to have a say? Who gets to be involved? Zarefsky would say more people should be involved. Let's get the voices in. Let's mix it up. Let's hash it out. But it also seems that the more voices that are participating, the harder it is to sort of understand any one particular voice, and maybe that sort of puts the onus on all of us to try to become more desperate and more clever or artful in terms of how we get our voice out. I mean, there's clearly struggles over being heard, being listened to, being seen, right? And I think social media both helps and complicates that phenomenon at the same time. But in any case, again, we're talking about matters of common concern. We're talking about controversies. We're talking about problems. We're talking about, agenda setting. We're talking about the struggle over power, because we're talking about the struggle over resources, the struggle over sort of winners and losers, how the game is conducted, right? All of it. These are different kinds of conversations and different kinds of conducts than you would typically find in the home or the private sphere, the personal sphere, or in the kind of the technical professional sphere, right? So hopefully that sense of public and publicness is making some sense. He talks about persuasion on the top right there. The spheres of discourse are contingent. Persuasion is necessary to construct and legitimate the ongoing processes of communication. So we're trying constantly to persuade one another to care, to get awakened, when I used to teach the public sphere class, I would often draw on the example of like when any one of us are just walking across campus, chances are at some point, some stranger, someone who we don't know will walk up to us. Maybe they have a clipboard in their hand. Usually if you see a clipboard, it's like, I'm out of here. Because they're trying to engage you. They're trying to get you to care or be aware of or get aroused by some issue, some problem, right? They're trying to persuade you to kind of join the conversation and become part of the concerned public. The very bottom right on 429, Goodnight talks about this project of recovery, which is essentially what Zarefsky was talking about, restoring deliberation. Even back 20 plus years ago, there was this sense of like, we've lost this public deliberation thing. They used to like really bemoan the fact that, television and mass media seems to have really kind of back then eroded the public's appetite for like long extended debates and conversation, and rational debates and very serious conversation, right? No one's really harping on the loss of this anymore, maybe because it's just gone, right? So you don't really hear too much in the kind of the social media age, this sort of like, if only we could get together and debate more, right? It doesn't even really crop up that much. I'd be curious if you guys think that like more of this is needed, or if it's more of like good riddance, we need something else, something better. And then I'm curious what you think that might be, or where we can find it, or where the good avenues are. In any case, these are some of the main issues having to do with publicness and public debate and conversation and confrontation. Now he gives two examples, because, if you think about the public as potentially anywhere out there in kind of social space, we're talking about both space and time, right? So who is affected? But think about just Las Vegas, right? Like who in Las Vegas is affected by the heat? Everyone probably. I don't know if there's any cool parts of Las Vegas. So the space sort of includes everyone. Now in terms of the time, in terms of the kind of like, we must do something about X, maybe it doesn't include everyone equally. Maybe it really just includes those people who agree, who are aware of a certain issue, right? In any case, the example of public space is about enlarging public space to be more inclusive, right? And so you can think about public space as like, hey, don't forget those people out in the north, or don't forget those people out in the east of Las Vegas. They also are affected by these issues, and they don't have the means to sort of get over to the town hall, so to speak, and have their voice heard, right? So we always got to be mindful of who's affected and whether or not they're able to participate. The public time example is the famous Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book, which effectively kicked off the environmental rights movement in this country. And the basic point here is that by doing good kind of investigative journalism and good sort of scientifically astute analysis of what was happening in terms of sprays and disinfectants and just the chemicals and what they were doing into our environment, she started to try to sort of get this conversation rolling, and there was a sense of urgency. We should not keep just, pumping chemicals into our environments. We need to sort of slow this down or stop it completely. We need to urgent, right? And so public space is about kind of reorienting the kind of the landscape of conditions and who's affected by things, and trying to improve conditions, and also expand those improved conditions. And then public time's about speeding up the means by which we address problems, right? So, in rhetoric at least, for decades now, environmental scholars have been talking about this business of time and urgency, right? Like, there is an urgency. We need to do something about what's going on with the environment. We're all experiencing it right now. The whole country is, the whole world is. I was over in Europe, and heat waves over there too. And, communication scholars have been talking about this for decades, literally decades. It's like, we need to get this sense of urgency onto the public's consciousness. We need to get people to see and feel that this is an urgent issue. We need to speed up time, right? And it seems to have not been terribly successful by and large, except now people are starting to say, holy crap. So quickening a sense of urgency, creating a sense of we must act. I wonder if anyone saw that movie on Netflix, Don't Look Up, about the asteroid that's hurtling toward Earth. Maybe not the most nuanced analyses, but it really gives voice to this same issue of like, there's a meteor, it's coming at us. For God's sake, look up and see it and recognize it so that we can act, right? We're trying to get action going here. Rhetoric's always about trying to get action going. Rhetoric's always about trying to get things to change and evolve in a better way and doing what you can to get others to help you do that, right? Sometimes the do what you can is deliberative, it's rational, it's based in evidence, logos appeals, right? But sometimes, that movie, Don't Look Up, is itself a really interesting rhetorical document because it is trying to get the public to look up, to get urgent around this question of the climate, right? At the time, it was sort of about masks as well, and about kind of like, let's not be ignorant with this whole, masking and vaccine business. But it's also sort of in the backdrop is about climate and the climate movement. And so the movie has all these moments of people shouting at the camera. There's that scene of Leonardo DiCaprio. He's literally just like red-faced, like screaming at the camera. And that's Leonardo, the actor, yelling at the public. Like, wake up, people. I've been giving these talks to the UN for decades now, or maybe about a decade. In any case, this is all interesting rhetorical stuff. It's about public confrontation. When I say public confrontation, I'm thinking about the way that the public sort of confronts itself. And in confronting itself by confronting problems, right? And so when you're thinking about publicness, you always want to be thinking about problems. I used to call them antagonisms back when I taught this class. But simply put, just think about problems, right? There's too much of something. There's not enough of something else. We need something to happen. We need something to change, or we need to stop doing something. There's a problem. Well, how do you get people to change their behaviors, to change their thoughts? You engage in public discourse, public engagement. Again, this stuff was written before social media and all these new digital tools. And I wonder just how much the old kind of way of thinking about public engagement still applies, or if we have to kind of throw out this kind of stuff and come up with whole new ways of thinking about public engagement. Because the thing about the media platforms is that they are quite insular, and they have these kind of looping effects where you tend to find people who you already agree with, or you find people who you violently disagree with, but there's not a lot of middle ground. And these papers and these voices here were really written for that kind of middle space of like, well, we kind of agree, we kind of disagree, let's try to figure it out, right? I don't see a lot of that kind of engagement happening anymore. And I'm wondering if you guys think like that would be nice, or who needs it, right? And what matters is just like our side versus their side. In any case, I wonder how your reception of these ideas might be, because like I said, I haven't taught that class in some time, because it just feels like I don't really see this conversation or these kinds of activities the way that we used to. So, any case, the other piece that we'll be looking at this week is by Eckstein and Young, and it's an example of an actual restaurateur, a chef, who is using a restaurant as a way to confront the public in a kind of educational type way. And so you can maybe think about what Zarefsky says about deliberation in terms of like sitting down at a meal, and there's all this information about the meal and where things came from and how it's trying to do differently than what we're used to. So it's an interesting example of like public confrontation. In any case, I'll shut up there. That's 2 readings. Try to be quick, but we're already at 28 minutes. So hope that works for you. As always, reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one.